Welcome to Speaking Freely. Death and taxes, so the cliche goes, about two of the biggest and most unpleasant issues that we all must face at some point in our lives, whether we like it or not. But fortunately, for most of us, we have the luxury of not having to confront the death part of that equation until much later in our lives, and at an unspecified point in the future. But for those of us in our society who are suffering from chronic forms of illness or debilitating physical pain, the question of whether or not to go on becomes a very real and present concern. To be or not to be, as the old bard once said. Now, it's at this point I should give a warning to our viewers. Tonight's topic will be pretty heavy. It deals with Canada's Medical Assistance in Dying program, or the so-called MAID laws. Now, this is more commonly referred to as assisted suicide outside of Canada. Now, with any state-sanctioned system of assistance in dying, we not only bring up potential personal traumas, but of course we also evoke echoes of the past, not only in Canada, but in many parts of the Western world. The eugenics movement was, in the early part of the 20th century, seen as an enlightened progressive idea in which society would be able to eliminate crime, disease, and disability via the selective breeding and in some cases forced sterilization of persons deemed of lower societal value. In Canada, several provinces actually empowered eugenics boards to determine who could have children, who would be sterilized without consent, and who would be entitled to receive medical care or be forced into incarceration inside of mental asylums, as they were known. Now, it was only after the horrors of World War II and the realization of the aggressive use of these same eugenics policies in Germany that the movement was largely discredited in the West. However, what some have argued is that a softer form of eugenics thinking is making a return through policies like MAID and other programs that try to screen or provide genetic testing before even life begins. In this way, unwanted traits are being removed from the population. These are clearly big and troubling questions. And we promise to handle this topic with the care and seriousness it deserves. And we won't be able to cover all aspects of the subject. We'll just be focusing on Canada's evolving assisted death laws and the thorny issues that extending the scope of these laws is bringing to Canadians. So this is clearly a complicated topic, but that's what we try to give you on this show, nuance and questions that other news programs don't bother asking. So we're going to start with a deep dive into the ethics associated with assisted death laws, and learn about why certain early proponents of MAID are now having sober second thoughts. We'll then move on to the law and the legal framework that has permitted assistance in dying in Canada, and why the expanding legal remit of this law to youth and to those suffering through mental health challenges troubling many in the legal community. So please join us after the break. It's an important issue, and we hope you learn something.
Well, I feel that if it's necessary, you must get several opinions before you do things like that.
People that may be depressed at this moment, but depression can actually, you can work with it and really cure it. Obviously, I agree with if you're an older person and you're on a ventilator, you really have very little time to go, then I agree with, instead of keeping the patient in pain, then I would agree that some help could be given in very limited situations.
I think that would be okay, provided that they had a medical exam, and it was determined that they were capable of making their own decisions.
I'm not knowledgeable on the situation, but I just wish there was more ways to help people so that death wasn't an immediate thought, or even this MAID situation where people feel like they need to extend a hand in order to die rather than extending a hand to be helped.
I'm very surprised.
Yes, I'm very surprised because
up every year, and they should do something about it. I don't know. Who's the responsible one? We should help these people.
Yeah, it's very sad and honestly just unbelievable to hear that so many people have turned to that, especially. But I guess in this time, like, people just feel that there's no way out. But yeah, it's sad to hear.
You know, I receive life without asking, and then I now finish my life asking to finish my life. And that's it. So it's up to each person to decide what to do.
Welcome back to Speaking Freely. We're now here with our guest, Professor Kerry Bowman from the University of Toronto. Professor Bowman is a bioethicist, someone who's devoted his life and career to the thorny questions surrounding our medical practices, end-of-life care, and on this topic, today's topic of medically assisted dying, no one else can, I think, speak to both the realities on the ground and to the ethical dilemmas that medical assisted dying has brought to Canadians. So, welcome, Kerry. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Now, where I wanted to start the discussion, because of that history you've had on the ground, which many professors of bioethics have not had. If you can walk us through that early history, your work in the community, and
yeah, you know, it really goes back quite a ways. My first introduction into you know, medical healthcare or medical cultures, I was a medical social worker. I did various things, but most of that centered around end of life and end of life decisions. I worked exclusively in critical care. So remembering that's people in many cases coming off life support because it's you know, it's not working, so to speak, and end of life decisions. So that was, and then, you know, I went back and retrained, as so many of us have done, inspired and moved by what I was seeing in end of life, and did a PhD in bioethics. I then continued on in the Toronto teaching hospitals as a bioethicist, which was not exclusively end of life, but it was a lot of my cases involved end of life. And as medical assistance in dying began to emerge as a concept, before it was legalized. I was also very much on the public speaking circuit, but more listening than speaking. I mean, going out to community centers and asking people in community centers what it is they were looking for, what did they think of the approaching legislation or the potential legislation. So then as it became legalized, I was directly, I don't say this with huge pride, I don't say it with huge regret either, but I've been directly involved in medical assistance in dying cases.
right.
And when I say directly involved, I mean directly at bedside. Now, of course, I'm PhD, not MD, so I'm not, you know, actively, you know, following medical processes here, but I would be there and I would be part of the whole thing.
What did you hear when you were listening to the community?
So what I heard, and as I went to these many community centers, the vast majority of people were older Canadians. And what most older Canadians were saying is, I want some control over this situation. I don't want to end up like my neighbor, my brother, my mother, my father, you know, because everyone, or most everyone at a certain age has seen these things. So what most people were really looking for is that sense of being able to make that decision. Yet most of the people that came, as I said, were older, you know, Canadians. But, you know, it was always very tricky because the thing is, even for these many people, if you lose capacity, you're still not in a position, you know, if there's years of incapacity, you're really not in a position to affect those wishes, even as it stands now. So that's what I saw. There were people that were expressing concerns, and certainly people within the disabled community. Now, I'm not suggesting this is one unified voice. That's a broad range of people. That, in fact, you know, as we moved into medical assistance in dying, that there would be an element of, there could be a dehumanizing effect for people with disability, as well as poverty. And I must say, as a bioethicist, I was cautiously supportive of medical assistance in dying. I always saw it, though, I must say, as much, much more ethically problematic than most of my my contemporaries did. I did not believe we could easily control for social determinants of health and vulnerability. I thought that that would be very difficult.
Can you explain that to our audience? What do we mean when social scientists, medical professors use the socioeconomic determinants of health? What are you talking about there?
So let's go look right to a case, a potential case example. Somebody that may have, extensive pain that has not been well controlled, as well as multiple symptoms, but is also living in poverty. Someone that's unable to pay the rent, may lose housing, at times has lost housing, is sort of the wolf at the door, to use that expression.
Right.
So the question is, if he or she applies for medical assistance in dying, what's the real driver there? Is it the diagnosis, the pain, and the affliction?
Yeah.
Or is it the fact that that is happening in such difficult and reduced circumstances? And that is what we have not been able to control for at all.
Right.
And I think in the first couple of years of medical assistance in dying, many of the requests were, and they still are, and the majority would be aggressive cancers, deteriorating syndromes, and people making autonomous decisions in many cases, but not all, people with high educational levels and full housing. But what we're seeing now is very, very difficult cases emerging that we do not have any clear answers for.
Yeah. And if this could be discussed in a wider lens too, we talked in Canada about palliative care for many years, and that was a movement that we needed to have supports for people to manage pain, especially sometimes, most often, obviously, towards the end of life when there were seemingly no other medical recourse. Can you speak a little bit about how the palliative care movement, if you will, and spokespersons feel about the medically assisted dying kind of legislation that's emerged?
It's mixed. So people within the field of palliative care, it's mixed. But certainly there have been many people and continue to be many people in palliative care that do not see medical assistance in dying as at all an easy fit with a palliative philosophy. So a palliative philosophy would be the complete comfort care of the dying, but that's emotional, spiritual, physical, really, really standing with people as they approach the dying process. Now, there is people in the palliative care process that do support medical assistance in dying, but certainly there are many that don't as well. And, remembering Canadian legislation, it's not, a doctor can't say, I think you may be eligible for medical assistance in dying, but I'd like you to try palliative care for a while. Can't do that, okay? That doesn't fit with Canadian concepts of autonomy. So if you have a patient that says, I don't have any interest in palliative care, you can tell me what it is, but I'm not pursuing it. That's where it stands and that's where it ends.
I see. Now, I think one of the slippery slope arguments, and we're going to talk about the law a little later on the program, but I want to hone this portion of the segment on the ethics. But I think it does bear upon the question I'm going to ask, which is, what can doctors say or not say? Because it was my understanding that when medical assistance in dying legislation was coming, it was very much driven by patient autonomy and patient requests. But is it not the case now that doctors are almost empowered or asked to bring it up in discussions around? I mean, I don't have
They can bring it up, and they're not in legal violation at all if they bring it up.
But what's the ethical?
Well, ethically, it's really, really problematic. And here's why. You could probably guess what I'm going to say. Any Canadian citizen has a right to know from a medical point of view what their options are, including medical assistance in dying. But, it's very hard to bring up medical assistance in dying as an option without it sounding like a kind of a maybe recommendation. Because why would a doctor bring up medical assistance in dying, at the time where you're telling me my diagnosis? Maybe he's suggesting or she's suggesting this. So it's very, very difficult. And there's a broad range of healthcare workers that can bring it up from a legal point of view. What I worry about is there's many people in healthcare, wonderful people. Not everyone has the training to make these very difficult judgments as to at what point it should be brought up.
And this feeds into your earlier point, the socioeconomic determinants, people with mental illness, people in poverty. Those are the dangerous situations that could make the mentioning of such a possibility and lead to an outcome that might otherwise not have happened. Is that correct?
It's possible. It's certainly possible, and especially mental health will. Mental disorders will be an acceptable criteria by March 17th of 2023, which is rapidly approaching. And with that's going to be a very, very tough question when that comes in. Probably one of the toughest we've seen. Because although right now many Canadians that request medical assistance in dying, and probably a majority, actually are not financially enormously distressed, or they're not, homeless or anything like that. Some are, but many are not. But, having worked with people with mental health disorders as a social worker, and this is common knowledge, the amount of people with full-blown mental health disorders that in fact are living in poverty and homelessness is really high. Because they're not, in many cases, they're not integrated, they're not well enough to secure employment and these things over the course of a longer period of time. So this is going to be very, very difficult. And I think Canada is tremendously ill prepared for what's coming in March.
To get us there, I think you would have a lot to say about what we do need to prepare for and what would be required if this extension of medically assisted dying it keeps going the way it is going. But just before that, I wanted to touch on an area or an issue that we don't want to broach, that we're very afraid to talk about, but it's the return of eugenics, or what's often been called soft eugenics, because we're not talking about the state programmatically picking and choosing who lives and dies.
No, we're absolutely not.
Yeah, let's not go there. We're not trying to inflame tensions, but tell us a little bit, tell the audience about what some people refer to as the soft eugenics.
Yeah, so soft eugenics would be, are we evolving, are we emerging into a society in which there's systemic forces that could really push towards, eliminating or limiting the amount of disabled people or people with certain challenges within our community, even if it's not intentional. So we've got the beginning of life and we've got the end of life. Certainly the beginning of life, and this would be a very different interview that I won't get into, but we've got increased prenatal testing. We have all of those things where we're actually looking for genetic markers and things which would suggest a disorder, potentially a disability. So that is occurring. And so some people would say, the problem with that is there could be an element of soft eugenics to it, where we're actually looking and selecting against disability. At the end of life, the argument would be, in terms of, potentially soft eugenics, is that over time, what could happen is people living with disability, particularly if they're not well supported, which absolutely is the case right now, you could begin to have social structures that kind of work against disabled people, where they may in fact make choices. I mean, my greatest worry about all of this is one that's rarely mentioned. It's the culture shift that we're not talking about. So what I worry about is, as Canada quite rapidly moves forward on this, that the day is coming when we'd look at a person with disability of any form. Let's imagine they're in a wheelchair or something, and whatever their challenge is, that we would look at them and start to think, why would they do that? Why wouldn't they request? And that would be a horror. That's a very different social fabric than what we live with now, where we reach out to people and offer support. And what I worry, and it's not in the conscious mind really, is that this strong movement towards medical assistance in dying will push us in a direction where we say, you don't really have to live like that, and why would you? And it'll subtly shift I think it's already shifting our culture.
Wow. So this last point is a really strong one, and one that, ending this segment would give some people pause. In this last sort of minute or two, what would be the antidote to that movement? We're talking about soft eugenics. That almost starts to begin to look like hard eugenics, but from a social-driven societal shift. So what could be some of the guardrails?
Hard eugenics would be the state saying,
for sure.
We don't want. So that would, and we don't have that.
But let's just say the soft eugenics movement gains more traction. So what would be an antidote or a guardrail potentially, from an ethical standpoint?
Social justice, that we actually offer people the supports that they need.
Right.
And, a lot of reality about Canadian society has come to our, has been dropped in our laps since the pandemic. We all really, including me, overestimated what a wonderful healthcare system we had. I never thought it was perfect. I was never that naive. But the pandemic also helped blow holes in our healthcare system. And what we're seeing now is that, we're seeing clearly some of the more difficult cases are being driven by poverty, are being driven by people living with disability that are not getting the supports they need. Now, to simply say to those people, you know what, you're vulnerable, you can't apply, that's another ethical problem.
Right.
So, if you're a high income person, you have access. And if we say, no, we're looking at your receipts and we're looking at your rent, no, not for you. I mean, that would be an ethical violation as well.
Right.
So we've kind of walked into this. I also think our government was fairly naive, because by allowing medical assistance in dying, our government, and I'm sure they'd never use this language, but I will, there was an acknowledgement by our government, the government of Canada, that some types of lives are not worth living. And I think when a government in a democratic society takes a position like that, it's going to be very difficult. And it has proven to be very difficult. And the world is watching. And I watch international media quite carefully, and most of it on Canada is fairly negative at this point in relation to medical assistance in dying.
Right. Well, with that, I want to thank you for bringing us to these important issues in a considerate and, I would say, thoughtful manner, in a way that most Canadians haven't yet really visited or seen. Thank you very much, Carrie. Join us after the break. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. Tonight's show has been about a very important topic that Canadians are struggling and grappling with. The question around assisted suicide, or as in Canada, it's more palatably known as medical assistance in dying, is a fundamental one. Yet it's emerged without much public debate until now. Joining us now is Scholl Professor of Law and Health at the University of Toronto, Professor Trudeau Lemons. He's taught and studied this issue. He is a published author, and he's not afraid to engage in the public debates that surround his work. And on this issue, he's been a very, very vocal voice of concern for the expansion of MAID and assisted dying in Canada. Welcome, Professor Lemons.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So I want to get started right away with this issue. Rather than get into the developments that led us to where we are, you want to say something, I think, pretty important about where we are today, which is the premise of this policy was to ostensibly help those at the very end of life who were terminally ill and who had perhaps enormous pain, other issues, and this was a policy that was aimed at that population. How is it that we've gone from there to a policy that now seems to extend to every form of suffering and is particularly impacting those with disabilities who have probably raised the most vocal concerns around the expansion of MAID and assisted dying? I wonder if you could just speak to that first off, and then we'll get into the story of how we got here.
Yeah, so it's interesting that over the holidays I met in Belgium actually with a psychiatrist who was involved in assisted suicide in the Netherlands from the early days, who actually was a strong supporter of assisted suicide, but more from the perspective of people deciding for themselves and taking their life in their own hands and at the end of life. And he told me that he's actually already distributing descriptions of the developments in Canada as a warning sign of where the Netherlands, which has one of the most liberal regimes in the world, should not be going. So it started, as many people know, in 2015 when the Supreme Court decided in the Carter decision that the absolute prohibition on physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, which has now been called in Canada medical assistance in dying, was unconstitutional as an infringement on people's or undefensible disproportionate infringement on people's fundamental rights. And the government responded to that judgment by enacting a law that restricted medical assistance in dying to people whose death was reasonably foreseeable. That never was exclusively targeting people with a diagnosis of a terminal illness. Actually, it was always from the beginning interpreted more broadly, but it still situated the medical assistance in dying in the context of broad end-of-life context. And the idea was, as the Supreme Court and also the Supreme Court in BC had declared in the Carter decision, that providing medical professionals with the power and with the authority to end the life of individual patients on the request of those patients should be an exceptional procedure and should be surrounded by the strictest possible safeguards. Immediately when the government came, or when Parliament came out with or enacted a law that restricted to the broad end-of-life context, advocates for an expansive system of medical assistance in dying challenged the law. And in both Quebec and BC, lawsuits were launched against the restriction to reasonable foreseeable death.
By who?
The decision in BC was abandoned, but the decision in Quebec was went to court, and I testified as an expert witness for the government, arguing in favor of a restriction to the end-of-life context, looking at what has happened in jurisdictions that don't restrict it to the end-of-life context. So at the time, I warned about what could happen when we broaden it up and go beyond the end-of-life context. So the Superior Court in Quebec didn't buy that argument. I mean, I was not the only one providing expert testimony. So several people argued from the perspective of suicide prevention, the potential impact on suicide prevention of going beyond the end-of-life context. But the Superior Court ruled that restricting it to the end-of-life context discriminated against the two people who went to court actually to challenge the law, and these were two persons with disabilities who arguably were not approaching their natural death in the way that the reasonable foreseeable death criterion was interpreted in Quebec. And so the court argued that it was discriminatory not to allow people who were who wanted to have their life terminated, who were suffering unbearably from a disease, illness, or disability, but who were not approaching their natural death, that it was discriminatory not to allow these people to have a medical system organized and a state-funded system of access to euthanasia. And so the government received from the court 1 year to enact new legislation, or 6 months actually originally, and it was prolonged afterwards, but received a period to adjust the law. Now, in normal circumstances, the law would have been appealed. A lower court decision in one province is not binding on other provinces. And in the normal circumstances, if this was not such a political debate, and if this was not such a practice that was particularly in Quebec quite popular, the government would have appealed. Actually, commentators have argued that the Attorney General had an obligation to defend the law of Parliament and should have gone to the Court of Appeal in Quebec and then eventually to the Supreme Court, saying that the reasonable foreseeable death criteria was there for a reason. It was there to protect the vulnerable populations, but also actually to protect the concept of a valuable life for people who are ill, elderly, or disabled. So people who are not in the process of dying still need, according also to our charter, to have their life protected by Parliament, by government, by the courts. But the government failed to appeal that decision. And it was not a coincidence that the Minister of Justice, who is also the Attorney General in this particular case, David Lametti, had already expressed when the law was the first law was debated, that he actually felt that based on the Supreme Court, that the law had to be more expansive.
And this gets into this issue, right? That the Supreme Court, by saying that the access question to medical assistance in dying or assisted suicide was the cornerstone of the law. The fact that the Supreme Court maybe makes that point doesn't necessitate such a liberal, small l, interpretation of what that means. That is extending it, this is what your work has done, to persons that are otherwise vulnerable, either because of their disability, their mental health status, their poverty. It's an issue you want to bring up. How has that debate completely been missed? Has it been another law that's come in under the cover of COVID that we haven't fully debated? And now we're just marching forward, expanding this policy to every person that might be suffering from something. But the reasonable, foreseeable death criteria is sort of been submerged and not talked about.
So I think the particularity in the Canadian context is that we had a Supreme Court decision. In many other countries that have very liberal euthanasia regimes like Belgium and the Netherlands came to it through parliamentary debate.
I see.
And they never recognized a right to assisted suicide or euthanasia. They simply declared that in some circumstances, doctors will not be prosecuted when certain criteria are fulfilled and people ask for assisted suicide or euthanasia. But they explicitly state in those jurisdictions that there's no right to assisted suicide or euthanasia, that assisted suicide and euthanasia is in those laws particularly recognized as a last resort when no other reasonable option exists that can address the suffering of the person.
Right.
In the Canadian context, somehow a Supreme Court decision that, in my view, could be read restrictively as focusing on exceptional circumstances of people who are approaching their natural death, somehow advocates for broad assisted suicide and euthanasia interpreted this as creating a constitutional right to suicide.
So we're going to get to this point. Canada's very much an outlier for that reason. But submerged in your statement there is a very important point. Somehow. How is it that certain groups have now mobilized? We talked in an earlier segment about something called soft eugenicism that's come back. The idea that we have to perfect the human race in some way. And by this, we mean those with disabilities, those that have mental health problems, get in the way of that perfection. Now, no one is talking in those terms, but the policies themselves evoke and create that outcome potentially. Do you think there's a soft form of eugenicism that's returned without the name plate? And with people who advocate for this, like you said, our Justice Minister and our Attorney General very gleefully, very eagerly took that opportunity to expand this policy without the proper debate. Do you think there's a group that does want this to be expanded, notwithstanding the concerns of these disability advocates and other poverty advocates?
There was some parliamentary debate, but there were some remarkable developments in the Canadian context. So when the government first introduced the law, they said that the law had to be expanded following the Truchon decision outside of the end-of-life context, but they acknowledged at least that there are certain problems with, or that there were specific problems, serious problems, when this would be expanded in the context of mental illness. When we would start saying to people who are suffering from a mental illness that they could ask for medical assistance in dying for, say, a very severe depression, anxiety, or any condition like that, simply because it's very hard to predict, whether people will get better if they have a mental illness. It's actually, in individual cases, impossible to predict that person will not get better or will get better. So most people get better, but we don't know who will not get better. So they originally declared that they would not include mental illness in the new legislation. That law was that excluded mental illness was voted on by the House of Commons. It goes to the Senate, and in the Senate, two senators in particular pushed for an amendment to add mental illness to the law. So mental illness was added to the law without debate in the House of Commons, without fundamental debate about whether mental illness should be part of that kind of legislation. It goes back to the House of Commons, and the Minister of Justice actually withdrew his cautionary approach with respect to mental health, because he didn't have a cautionary approach towards people who are not dying in general, but at least mental illness was still excluded. He withdrew his opposition against the inclusion of mental illness, and the House of Commons basically voted then in favor of an expansion, including mental illness, which was suspended for 1 year to allow the government supposedly to get ready.
It's worse still. Doesn't it include people suffering from dementia who then are presumably not in capacity to decide whether they would want or not?
So that has not yet been included. So dementia or Alzheimer's can be a basis, but the person who asks for euthanasia or assisted suicide, medical assistance in dying, has to be capable of decision making. So there is now a debate whether it should be allowed on the basis of advance request, but that is not yet in the law. But you were asking about the, I would say, the indirect eugenic components of the law. So what is striking in this whole debate is that the law was, I would say, adopted without very significant debate, was adopted with very strong opposition of all major disability rights organizations, disability justice organizations in Canada. They all opposed the expansion of the law. The message of these organizations was, you are pushing here an expansion of a facilitating of the ending of life of persons who are otherwise not dying, who are not approaching their natural death, but you're targeting with that actually only persons with disabilities. Because if you're not a person with a disability and you're not in the process of dying, and you ask for medical assistance dying to your physician, your physician will say, "Sorry, I mean, I think we need to prevent your suicide." So we as a society don't believe that you should be dying. But if you're a person with a disability and you have an irreversible decline of capability, which is one of the criteria of the law, and you say that you suffer unbearably from your disability or your illness, you will be supported with state-funded, a medical system organized dying. So it's basically, yes, it's not imposed, supposedly imposed by the government. It's not imposed by the medical system, but it's, I would say, eugenics by choice.
It's a differential treatment.
The message is sent by our society. If you're not a disabled person and you're not in the process of dying, we as a society won't facilitate your death. We won't push you indirectly by providing all the potential means to have a doctor end your life. But if you're a disabled person, you deserve to have access to that service. So this has been pushed through in the midst of a pandemic against the opposition of all major disability rights organizations. I'm not aware of any policy in the Canadian context, and I've been teaching in health law and policy for more than 20 years. I've never encountered any policy that has been imposed on a population based on a skewed conception of their equality rights, when all of these major organizations are saying, we don't want this. We don't need access to dying. We need access to good support. We need access to a quality of life. We need access to a dignified life.
Absolutely. And just for our audience, they should know that this is not the status of countries, as you said, that had moved in this direction before Canada did. Canada is very much an outlier in the way in which it's now expanding the right to die or medically assisted suicide. It's not the norm. And I think if Canadians understood how far away from the programs that exist in other countries, they might even be a little more shocked and perhaps asking their members of parliament to sort of put a brake on this.
I mean, particularly, Belgium and Netherlands do allow for outside of the end of life context, but as I explained to you before, Canada is unique in the sense that it, for example, doesn't even require that a doctor has to agree that there are no other medical options left. In other words, according to Canadian law, it's up to the patient to decide whether they want to have whether they want to try other medical options, and they actually can. So, in other words, in the Canadian context, medical assistance in dying has been turned into a first-line therapy on demand for people who are often in vulnerable situations, who may be struggling with poverty, with lack of access to care in a country, Canada, which actually underperforms when we're looking at the investment in healthcare and disability support.
That's astounding. I want to thank you, Professor Lemons, for coming and speaking to our audience today. On that note, which is not a very happy note, I think what's important here is what we've learned, how Canada has expanded this policy, has expanded it quickly, I would say under the cover of COVID, when we haven't had the debates, the proper debates we should be having in Parliament. And now we stand at a precipice when this policy can be expanded even more. And I think we need to be challenging our policymakers and listening to the advocates, poverty groups, disability groups, and advocates for our veterans when they say, let's put a break on this policy and get it right. We'll be back after this break.
Yes, very much so.
I just totally agree with that statement.
Absolutely. I mean, people who are in medical, who require who have mental illnesses, should be treated accordingly. And suicide is not the ultimate goal for these guys, because there's always hope, particularly people who have mental illness. There's a difference between people who have long-term cancer treatments, etc. Then that's a different ballgame.
To do as much as you can to prevent the necessity of putting them to death, rather than giving them a chance at life. Life is a precious thing.
I know of some people, and that's one of the reasons why I suggest that in limited situations that have some mental issues, but they were able to, survive it, cure it, and now they're in great shape.
Well, right now there's a shortage of doctors and nurses. We need more medical care in all fields. So I think we should do as much as we can, but I guess for budget reasons we can't. And hopefully in the future we will be able to, like people with dementia, with cancer, and they're always raising money all the time. But I think we need more research and more, more help in that way. And as I said, well, you said that as made as a last resort, I would say, yeah, a last resort.
I feel like people want help. People are calling out for help, and I think MAID is kind of extending a hand, but it's people who are reaching out to MAID. It's almost like I need your help, but this is the only way you're going to help me. But I think we should find more ways to, whether it's in schooling, at work, at jobs, find ways for people to express themselves, to talk, because a lot of people have this built up energy and this sadness and anger and don't know where to put it. And a lot of people feel trapped and alone, and it deteriorates the body if you don't know how to deal with these situations. And for MAID to come out and say, like, we'll help you, but only in the situation of dying, that's terrible. We, especially being in school, we need people to talk to. We need something to show that we're not alone, right? Because it's clear that 1 million people feel this way. It's just how we handle it, because I think we should be more kind and loving to one another, especially in such a time of uncertainty.
Welcome back. That concludes our episode on Canada's Assistance in Dying program. Few decisions in our lives are as personal and difficult as the decision of how we choose to end our life. But for many Canadians who are suffering from chronic illness or debilitating forms of physical pain, it is a decision that they and their families may be compelled to consider. It's in our interest as a society to face these issues, the issue of assisted death, without ideological blinders or judgment, but face it head on with ethical and legal questions front of mind. And as always, we need to approach these questions with that appropriate sense of empathy for all those involved in the process, be they doctors or patients. Everyone's story is different. But in making assisted death easier, there is always a danger that we may begin to adopt a concept of who should live and who should die that is informed by the failed perspectives and ethics of the eugenics movement, which in many ways would be a moral devolution for where we as Canadians should be on this issue, ethically speaking. And assisted death should be viewed correctly as the option of last resort for those with debilitating physical pain, What some concerned observers are pointing out is that we can't start using MAID as a way of papering over the social problems present in our society. Someone unable to pay their rent, someone who's too depressed to access mental health care. These should not be seen as candidates for medical assistance in dying. The socioeconomic determinants of health, along with the investments we need to make in our healthcare system to deal with things like aging populations, those things need to be made. And we shouldn't rely on an assisted death program to deal with our inability to handle social and medical deficiencies in our society. So thank you once again for inviting us into your homes today. This was clearly a challenging topic and one that Canadians are dealing with right now. We hope that this discussion has helped clarify some of these important issues and pointed out some of the really important challenges that MAID laws are bringing to the fore. So see you next week, and as always, stay curious and remain compassionate.